Welcome to the 12th National Home Visiting Summit. I'm Diana Rauner, president of Start Early, and it's my honor to kick off our third virtual gathering. If this is your first summit, or you've been with us from the start, we're thrilled that you have joined us this week to engage with parents, peers, and experts to advance the field of home visiting. We're honored once again to welcome parents and providers into our conversations. The Home Visiting Summit, ideally, is a place for all of us to push our thinking around systemic improvements in our field. Parents and providers must be at the table for strategy and decision-making discussions. This week, we expect more than 1,000 attendees and speakers from 47 states, Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C., the U.S. Virgin Islands, Australia, and Ireland. There will be extraordinary opportunities to learn and grow together. I hope you'll get involved and enjoy access to more than 70 live and on-demand workshops and plenary sessions. Connect with your peers by joining the virtual attendee hub and gaining access to over 1,000 professionals attending the conference. Participate in the National Home Visiting Summit's community as a practice and join virtual sessions for unique networking experiences. This year's agenda is dynamic and focused on the current challenges and circumstances we all face. We'll focus on 5 key topics: building systems that work for families, home visiting as a vital component of the early childhood system, maternal health equity, addressing the workforce crisis through systems change, building on lessons from COVID-19. And for the first time, the summit offers a Spanish language track, which approximately 10% of all registrants will be joining. This is a great start, but we know we have more work to do as we continue on our journey of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. The summit has always been a safe, supportive environment for us to openly discuss and wrestle with the relevant and provocative issues that create barriers to advancing our field. Today, we're grappling with ongoing impacts of COVID that have created disparities in healthcare, childcare, early learning services, and economic security. We're looking for ways to enhance care coordination through improved systems change. We're facing reproductive, social, and racial injustice. We need to think about how to achieve equitable access to reproductive health care, reduce maternal and infant mortality, and consider how the Dobbs decision impacts women, and particularly women of color. This week, let's encourage one another and share lessons learned and emerging concepts for change for your programs, communities, and systems. None of this would be possible without the dedicated support of Summit leaders, our funders, the Heising Simons Foundation and the Pritzker Children's Initiative. And I'd like to take a special moment to thank Deanna Gombe, the outgoing president of Heising Simons Foundation, for her many, many years of advocacy and support in the home visiting field. Deanna, you have been such an incredible leader and personal driver of home visiting over your career. We are so grateful for your passion and dedication, and your advocacy has raised the importance and expanded the work of so many. Congratulations on many years of meaningful impact. I'd like to thank our steering committee, the home visiting leaders with expertise across policy, research, and practice, who are instrumental in helping us plan the agenda and select the workshops and speakers. A big thank you to our workshop contributors and plenary speakers, and of course to all of you for joining us and engaging with the summit this year. Before we officially get started, I have some exciting news to share. We will be returning to an in-person summit next year in Washington, D.C., with virtual opportunities to participate as well. More information is coming soon. Thank you, and enjoy your experience.
Hello, and welcome to the 2023 National Home Visiting Summit. I am Kelly Woodlock, and I will be your session plenary host for the week. We are so excited to have you with us as we dive into some deep elements of content throughout the week. Next slide, please. We have over 1,000 attendees with us this week and over 125 speakers sharing their wisdom. We have 49 states, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and 4 countries represented. And as Diana mentioned in her opening recording, we also will offer this year for the first time ever a Spanish language track. Several workshops will be provided in Spanish with English translation, and our on-demand and poster sessions will also be translated into Spanish, as will this plenary session in live translation. Next slide, please. We want to also acknowledge the years of experience in the field that will be joining us this week. As you can see, we have quite a range, from newer home visitors to those who have 15 plus years in the field. So welcome all. We look forward to learning from all of you throughout the week. Next slide, please. There are several ways for you to engage throughout the summit with our virtual platform. For example, you can use direct messaging, chat directly with other attendees by visiting the attendee profile and using send message options. You can use our instant network feature, which matches you with a partner for 5 minutes to get to know one another and discuss important topics, with the opportunity to extend your learning time together if needed. You can also check out our discussions tab on the website that will allow you to participate in conversations via chat rooms on key topics and themes throughout the summit. Check out the discussions tab on our website page. And of course, join us on Twitter at #HBSummit. I encourage you to be active social media promoters and to connect through Twitter as possible. We're really looking forward to that. Next slide, please. And last but not least, summit engagement also includes this year a conference website game. You can access points and work toward prizes by engaging in the summit through the content and the conference website. You can learn more about this on our FAQ page, and the prizes will be awarded for the top 3 participants from bookshop.org or Headspace. So please play along. It should be really fun. Next slide, please. As Diana mentioned in her opening remarks, the summit provides a safe and brave space for those invested in home visiting to grapple with complex topics and systems issues. We welcome all points of view and encourage you to maintain respect for others, speak your truths, and create a conference environment that encourages confidence and trust. We want this to be a place for open dialogue and for honest conversations. Next slide, please. Okay, without further ado, we'd like to introduce our first plenary session, Voices from the Field, Building Policies and Practices that Strengthen Home Visiting. The last several years have only really underscored for us the critical role that home visitors play in their work with families, programs, and communities across the country. And yet our workforce has reached a recruitment, retention, and well-being crisis point. Addressing these workforce issues really relies on several factors and must include the voices of home visitors when making decisions that affect them. It is with this in mind that we created this particular plenary session that will incorporate the voices of professional experience, conversations about well-being, and on dialogue about future solutions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this session, Gina Capito. Gina directs both the National Alliance of Home Visiting Models and the Rapid Response Virtual Home Visiting Collaborative. Gina has been working in the prenatal space for 25 years, prenatal to 5 space for over 25 years, with experience including the management of childcare programming, early Head Start, developmentally oriented pediatrics, national home visiting models, and child welfare programming. Gina's work has involved managing projects, including the development of birth to 3 learning guidelines, recommending and implementing quality support structures for home visiting, crafting national scale learning communities across Head Start and childcare, and managing comprehensive fiscal analysis and cost modeling projects. We are very excited to have Gina and this panel on board. And without further ado, Gina, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you Start Early for this platform. I want to begin before we jump in with our panelists and our content to really highlight part of what Kelly started with, that this session is about our field. If you have had a moment to look at the session description, it particularly mentions three parts of a crisis that we have. We have a recruitment, retention, and overall workforce crisis. One of the most important things for us all to be thinking about is how we cannot solve or remediate the elements of this crisis without the field itself. And so this foundation of starting with voices from the field, all of you being included in that, not just us as panelists that are participating in the plenary, is of critical importance to this. So one of the first things that I want to do is talk about this idea of how we're engaging together in our session. As Kelly mentioned, a couple of the roles that I hold currently in the home visiting space, one of those is related to the Rapid Response Virtual Home Visiting Project. And many of you have accessed the Rapid Response from the very, very early days of the pandemic. And what the goal of Rapid Response was to make good access for information on how to do virtual home visiting. We know that the home visiting field turned on a dime, quite literally, over a weekend for many employees to go from seeing families on a Friday in their home to seeing them on a screen or over the phone the very next week. Part of what Rapid Response goal was to support that transition. We learned many things during the pandemic, there's no question, but through the participation in the way that Rapid Response was built, some of the most important things that we learned for the field and learned from you as a field were related to the idea of the power of shared learning and the power of community. And what we want to do is not lose that. While we came together and responded in a way because of the nature of a pandemic, there is such power in all of you as the field and supporting each other, as well as thinking about what are the changes that we need to see and how do we drive those changes as a field coming up from the field. So with that in mind, I want to direct you to some of the ways to participate today. So you all are very familiar with Zoom, I'm sure by this point, after many years of this, but just want to highlight a couple pieces of Zoom and particularly how things are functioning within this webinar. There's of course the chat feature, and I've seen lots of activity in the chat already, introductions to each other, reinforcing things that folks are saying. So you know how to use the chat, and we want to continue to see engagement with each other in the chat. We also have available to us the Q&A feature. And so we do hope that if you have really specific questions that you want to pose to panelists, or you want to have integrated into our last few minutes of our plenary, which do include the question and answer section, go ahead and put those in the Q&A. We have folks watching the Q&A, and you see that usually it'll be at the bottom of your screen when you're in the platform, as is the chat feature as well. We also are watching the chat to see the dialogue across each other, and we're going to encourage you throughout our presentation. There will be points where we will specifically say, go ahead and answer that question in the chat across you all as a group. Because one of the things that we found over the course of doing webinars starting back in March of 2020 and doing them almost monthly through to March of 2023 is that home visitors as a field coming together in this sort of community, that they're sharing ideas, they're offering support for one another, you're offering empathy for one another's circumstances and the struggles and challenges that we all share in working in this sort of deeply personal, deeply family engaged work, and making connections. And what we also found through that, and we see this continuing forward into this summit and hopefully beyond in many other ways, is that this sort of connection and field building and power of your community is outside of what model you deliver. It's outside of what funding source pays for the programming that you're doing at your home visiting program. It doesn't matter what state or community you're in this field facing community that we're all part of. And even what type of home visitor, whether you're a nurse home visitor, whether you're a social worker, an education-based home visitor, the opportunity of functioning as a community and supporting each other cuts across all of those things. And in many ways, the Zoom chat is a feature of that, in a place that sort of relationship is occurring. And we want to continue. We want to bring that forward, and we want to do even more with it. So this plenary is just one piece of that. So after that little bit of housekeeping on how you engage, we're going to move right into learning a little bit more about our panelists. We have 3 home visitors joining us on the panel. Again, what's really important with this plenary is the idea that this is not just about the home visitors that are on the panel. They are giving voice to many things that reflect our field as a whole, but it is about all of you within this panel, all of you engaging in it. So there'll be places where we'll specifically say, as I mentioned, go ahead and answer this question as well. We do have with our panelists some great diversity across the country and types of programs and roles that folks fill out. So I wanted to start with some brief introductions to each of the home visitor panelists. Then we're going to start with some reflection, and then we'll move into a little more content on learning more about the idea of home visitor well-being. So starting with introductions, I'm going to start with April Lynn Winters, who's the program coordinator with Tioga Babies. April's joining us from New Mexico. April is a descendant of both the Taos Pueblo and the Hunkpapa Sioux community. April is currently an enrolled member of the Taos Pueblo. April has been working at Tioga Babies for many years as a home visitor and has recently moved into program coordinator role, as well as still serving some families. That resonates with all of us, right? We've all been in that role where we're managing, supervising, and may also still be serving families. And April also has deep experience with developing curriculum that is responsive to the community that the program is serving, the tribal community, the language and culture of the tribal community, and really integrating that also alongside national models and curriculums. So welcome, April, and thank you for joining us. Our next home visitor voice is Devin St. Pierre, and Devin's actually joining us from Massachusetts. Devin went very quickly from a home visitor for first-time parents to a senior home visitor, and then moved into a supervisory role. And so it's a great example of how the leadership and pipeline that is the possibility within our field is so important to the sort of rich wealth and knowledge that we all bring to this, that we carry these different leadership roles within the work. One of the things that I wanted to share with folks, because I think it's just sort of a very cool award, Devin recently received the Drop the Mic Award for her dedication to this work and dedication to families within this space. So sort of a cool thing to have received as a home visitor and a way to honor her home visiting commitment. Next, we're going to move to the middle of the country. Tyler Reynolds is joining us from Illinois. Actually, Joliet, Illinois, which is just down the road from me. I happen to be in the Chicagoland suburbs as well as Tyler. So we're sort of all over. Tyler has been a home visitor with Easter Seals Jumpstart for about almost 7 years now. Tyler started in early care and education, which many of us find ourselves working across many elements of the prenatal to 5 space. And Tyler refers to finding home visiting by accident. And I think many of us have a story sort of akin to that. We don't know that something like home visiting exists when we're going to high school or college and learning about things that we could do as a career. And so I think that happy accident, it might be one way to describe it as well. And Tyler has been working in the field now for almost 10 years and working in home visiting in particular. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for your multiple roles and multiple leadership within the home visiting space. And I know that you join me in welcoming all of our participants in the chat to share their experiences as leaders and as home visiting staff in really thinking about this concept of voices from the field. We are also joined by Dr. Mariel Spar. I'm going to do a little bit more introduction to Mariel right before she takes over her content. And so before we move to that, I do want to start with that idea of a reflection. I want to start us with a reflection question. And this is one of those first places where all of you joining today have an opportunity to reflect on this as well in the chat. This is for all of us to think about this idea of, in your experience in the home visiting field, what currently allows you to be successful in your role. There's a couple examples of answers from your colleagues from across the country on the screen right now. You see the other folks have reflected. We're also going to hear from each of our panelists on this. And I'd like to start with April reflecting on what currently allows her to be successful in her role.
Well, I think it starts with being able to establish and develop a relationship with the family. really hearing them reflect on their experience in home visiting and being able to actually observe the growth in the relationship between the caregiver and the child, and really getting that feedback back from the families of their experience and the impact that home visiting has. Reflective supervision has been extremely helpful to me, and also having a supervisor that understands the work of the home visitor and the needs that we have to be able to do that work.
Thank you, April. Why don't we move to Devin next to reflect on this question?
I completely agree with what April said. I feel like your connections and your relationships with the family is, first so rewarding to see them grow and to see the impact that you have. And, when I really think about what's led me to be successful as a home visitor, my first thought is the support that I receive from not only, my supervisor and management, but from my peers, being able to have people in my corner celebrating the successes, celebrating the wins of the families, but also sitting with you through the hard times and just that support that you receive.
Thank you. And Tyler, what are your reflections?
Yeah, I want to echo everything that April and Devin had said. Reflective supervision, meeting with the families. But for me personally, it's having a supervisor who allows me to kind of explore different things in my work and be able to be a home visitor, be able to kind of help with some special side projects, being in the community that is going to support the families that we work with, and just kind of having the ability to essentially be everything, but not have to commit to everything all the time.
Thank you all. We're seeing, if you're able to watch the chat at the same time, one, the chat's moving a lot. There's lots of great responses and discussion occurring in the chat, but we're definitely seeing some things echoed. The peer support, as well as reflective supervision and supervisorial support, are definitely coming up again and again in the chat. Trust and the idea of the relationship with the families being that's what's currently allowing you to sort of succeed and feel the most successful in your role. And then the idea of sitting with both the good and the bad, I think that sort of making sure that when we say support, that support isn't only when someone is telling you how to handle a situation, but maybe just sitting alongside of you when you're struggling with. And that's definitely something that we found in these sorts of chat engagements, that sort of empathy. I might not have the answer, but I see you and I hear you, that what you're dealing with, and I'm here alongside of you. And I think that is a form of peer support that we not always sure that we can quantify the impact of that sort of peer support. With that, I'm actually going to now introduce Dr. Spar and talk a little bit more about her background, because this theme of well-being and that idea of what do we quantify and what do we know about well-being, there's actually been some recent work done on that as applied research, so to speak. And Dr. Spar can correct me if that is a complete misuse of that term to reference how to think about this research, but I want to sort of highlight the nature of it being more practical in nature, that it's and that it is much more down in the field as this sort of research on home visitor program and staff well-being. Dr. Spar is with James Bell Associates and has done this sort of work in many different areas of the field, including thinking about the implementation and evaluation of training and coaching interventions to support home visitors and family engagement, which speaks to so much of what makes you feel successful in your role. Many people mention that engagement and success with families as being a key piece. And also having thought more about the idea of implementation of quality home visiting program and what are the strategies, how do we evaluate that and understand sort of the secret sauce that goes behind that. And so with that, I'm going to turn it to Dr. Spar to tell us more about the well-being research.
Thanks so much, Gina, and so exciting to hear voices from the home visitors and how that's sort of reflected in the work that I'm going to talk about for a little bit. So as Gina mentioned, this is very much an applied project. I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that we did as part of the Supporting and Strengthening the Home Visiting Workforce Project, otherwise known as SASHV. which I just want to note is supported by the Administration for Children and Families, the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, in collaboration with the Health Resources and Services Administration. So the content that I'm going to walk us through fairly quickly so that we have some opportunity to hear from all of you and our panel more closely reflects the work of that project and how we came to conceptualize what we're calling professional well-being. So when we started SASS-HV, we recognized that well-being can really refer to a wide variety and multiple domains, from one's physical, emotional, intellectual, social, financial, and spiritual well-being that occurs across the various contexts of one's daily life. So your personal as well as your professional life. However, for SASS-HV projects, we thought that such a broad definition, while important to consider, might make it challenging to define, assess, and increase professional well-being and to gauge the impact of efforts that are designed to promote professional well-being. So you can see on the screen here that for SASS-HV, we really conceptualized and specifically focused on professional well-being as one, the workplace experiences that are unique to home visiting. I think we all know that it's a fairly unique program and service delivery strategy, as well as how those workplace experiences influence the dimensions of well-being that can affect home visitors' work with families. So I just put that out there so you can see sort of the parameters that we're talking about when we say professional well-being and how we've conceptualized it for this project. So one might ask, why focus on professional well-being? I think Gina's touched on a lot of important points too, as well as why it's important. But I think this quote here on the left, originally applied to preschool teachers and modified on the right to apply to home visitors, provides a pretty clear rationale for why professional well-being matters in the context of home visiting. Essentially, the well-being of families and children served through home visiting is very closely linked to the well-being of home visitors. And when we started to examine this topic a little bit closer in SASS-HV, we realized that a lot of existing research within home visiting and adjacent fields really focuses on outcomes associated with the lack of well-being. So I'm sure you've all heard a lot of information about burnout, depressive symptoms, secondary traumatic stress, turnover in the workforce. And while these are all important topics to explore, it doesn't really give us a lot of information about what professional well-being is, how we might best promote it, and how it can favorably affect workplace performance and outcomes. So we really think a better understanding of home visitor professional well-being is a key component of workforce development for the home visiting field. So most of what I'm going to focus on quite quickly today is a conceptual model that we developed for the SASS-HV project on home visitor professional well-being. Before I do that, I just want to mention the steps that we took to develop the conceptual model. I won't go into each of these in detail other than to highlight that we did review a large body of research within home visiting and adjacent fields, as well as from broader fields such as organizational psychology, occupational psychology. There's a fair bit of research from broader fields, reviewed existing conceptual models and relevant theories. We held a series of input sessions with practitioners. So as Diana mentioned, and as Gina's mentioned, the importance of bringing practitioners to the table. So we've engaged with research with home visitors and supervisors, as well as individuals that support practitioners. So for example, professional development providers, technical assistance providers, model representatives, and we engaged with experts in topics such as general workforce well-being, early childhood education workforce well-being, and the home visiting workforce more broadly. So as I go through the conceptual model, I'm not going to highlight or mention or summarize all of the research that supports all of the components that were ultimately included in the conceptual model. If that's of interest to you, I recommend looking at the final report for SASS-HV, which does sort of present that research in digestible bite-sized pieces if you're interested in that. So I'm going to walk through the conceptual model quite quickly, again, focusing more on the drivers, which relate to a lot of the themes that we've heard so far in this panel, and will hopefully set up some of the discussion moving forward with the home visitors. This is the model in its entirety, and so we're going to kind of go through it piece by piece and build back up to what you see here. So the model depicts home visitor professional well-being as comprised of 4 positively framed dimensions. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of existing research does focus on lack of well-being or outcomes associated with the lack of well-being. So for example, burnout or depressive symptoms. And we really wanted to address that gap by focusing on strength-based dimensions of well-being that systems can strive to support. The model also builds on existing research, recognizing that these dimensions obviously overlap and influence one another. They don't operate in complete isolation from one another. So the dimensions included in the model are job satisfaction, psychological well-being, self-efficacy and confidence, and job meaning and fulfillment. Here, I just want to acknowledge that the model is consistent with prior ecological models within and outside of home visiting, and acknowledges that home visitors are really nested within multiple contexts or levels of a home visiting system. And so the key thing to note here is that there are contextual factors that operate at each level of this home visiting system to collectively influence the drivers of professional well-being that we'll go through now. So very much thinking about this more as a collective, systemic approach and not an individual home visitor approach. As I mentioned, the model describes 5 key drivers of home visitor professional well-being, again, situated across those 5 levels of a home visiting system. We'll go through each of the drivers. Again, I don't have time to mention the research that supports each of these, but you can see the final report if you're interested in understanding more about that. So the first driver is resources and supports. And so this includes resources and supports that home visitors need to effectively carry out their job responsibilities. It includes a lot of things that have come up so far, such as program materials, professional development, coaching, training, supervision, data systems and tools, technology resources, including reliable internet, cell phone, laptop, adequate time built into schedules for allowable travel and data reporting expectations and requirements. This driver also includes clarity surrounding job roles and responsibilities and alignment of job requirements with home visitors' skills and expertise. The second driver is flexibility and autonomy, which I think Tyler kind of touched on this a little bit, that it includes home visitors' sense of adaptability and control in carrying out their work. So this includes things like being able to adjust and change the timing, location, and number of hours worked as needed, but it also includes being able to use your knowledge and practice expertise to adjust plans and make decisions about how best to provide services and program content to families on any given day within an individual visit. The third driver, which I think is what people have mentioned in the chat quite a bit and has come up in the themes we've discussed so far, is relationships and connections, which is really a critical component of home visiting work. And so this driver centers on home visitors' sense of supportive and helpful relationships and connections. So this might include relationships with other service providers in the community, relationships with colleagues and supervisors, as well as obviously those relationships that are formed with families and children. This driver also includes leadership skills and competencies, positive workplace climates and cultures, including attention to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. The fourth driver is compensation, validation, and recognition, which focuses on a sense of validation and recognition for the work that home visitors do. So this includes things like public awareness and appreciation, as well as just general understanding of home visiting services, home visitor participation in program decision-making, and incentives and advancement opportunities for job performance. It also includes validation and recognition via adequate and equitable salaries and benefits. And then the final driver is job stressors and demands, which is shown here in red because it obviously operates a bit differently than these other drivers, but is an unavoidable aspect of working in the workplace. So this focuses on perceived job stressors and demands that home visitors experience as a function of carrying out their jobs. We recognize that it really is a unique service delivery strategy, and home visitors face unique stressors in their day-to-day work with families. So it might include things like exposure to traumatic contexts and situations, having to manage paperwork and data collection requirements, and feelings of isolation that home visitors might experience if they're spending their entire day traveling from families' homes to different homes. That might also include discrimination and microaggressions in the workplace or in the context of working within families' homes, since home visitors can't always control their work environment. So those are the 5 drivers. I know it's gone quite quickly, but I just want to move on to some other aspects of the model, and just call attention to the fact that the model recognizes that an individual's personal characteristics obviously influence the way that they interact with and experience the work, and also contributes to professional well-being. So for example, research suggests, not surprisingly, that individual worker attributes like psychological and personal resources, one's own approach to self-evaluation, and what your own priorities are, impact how you benefit from job resources and mediate these associations between these key drivers that you see on the left, the dimensions of professional well-being, and the outcomes that we'll go through briefly now. So you can see some example individual home visitor factors included in the model. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but just meant to provide an example and acknowledge that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, that some home visitors might need different resources and supports as compared to another home visitor. So last, the model includes a series of outcomes at the home visitor, program, family, and child levels. And home visitor outcomes are really viewed as the immediate result of enhanced professional well-being, and are viewed as the pathway for achieving program, family, and child level outcomes as a function of professional well-being. So just as one example, improvements in home visitors' personal well-being and the dimensions of physical, social, financial, or spiritual well-being may enable home visitors to be more engaged and fully present in their work with families, and to develop quality working relationships, which promotes the quality of home visiting services and ultimately family and child outcomes. So I know I sort of gave warning that this was going to be kind of like a really quick walkthrough of the conceptual model. There's certainly more detail in the full report, but I'm going to shift gears a little bit here before I turn it back over to Gina and the panel to talk a little bit about another activity we did for SASHV, which was an environmental scan to identify existing resources, strategies, and measures on professional well-being within the home visiting field, as well as adjacent fields. And the purpose of this scan was really to provide a snapshot of the nature of current efforts to promote well-being that could be applied to home visiting. This is a really quick high-level summary of the findings from the environmental scan. We've reviewed a total of 86 training strategies, resources, and measures. And while we did identify a lot of really promising materials that are easily accessible, many are virtual, many were specifically designed for the home visiting field, and many are free. So there's some nice attributes of the materials that we did review. We did notice that there was some limitations in the materials we reviewed as part of our environmental scan. And that was that many of the materials focused on modifying individual home visitor behaviors. So for example, by teaching home visitors self-care techniques or how to practice mindfulness to address job stressors and demands, prevent burnout, and promote professional well-being. Very few of the materials we identified focused on structural, organizational, or systemic approaches to promote professional well-being. So really, the materials kind of place the responsibility of promoting professional well-being on individual frontline workers or individual home visitors. We see this really as a clear limitation of existing resources and materials, as research does suggest that organizational level efforts are more predictive of workforce well-being compared to individual level efforts. So in sum, to address existing gaps, there's really a need to think about strategies at all levels of a home visiting system. So instead of focusing on one or two pieces of the puzzle, such as home visitor level or program level strategies, there's really a need to focus on all pieces of the puzzle and consider structural, organizational, and system level strategies, which will require a lot of coordination and collaboration and implementing multi-pronged approaches to promote home visitor professional well-being. And we really are hoping that the conceptual model and the ecological perspective of the model encourages entities at all levels of the home visiting system to critically consider how their work influences the well-being of the home visiting workforce. So this might include taking a close look at grant requirements and policies that are in place, and whether those inadvertently present barriers to local programs to implement strategies to support the well-being of their workforce. It also might include looking at policies that might prevent providing fair and adequate and equitable salaries to home visitors and advancement opportunities. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Gina to talk about some opportunities for policies moving forward.
Thank you, Mariel. We're going to move to really focusing on this idea of the structural, organizational, or systemic approaches. We know that in many instances, there's a lot of things that is happening at the programmatic level to try and address workforce well-being, right? We know this happens, and it does put the burden on the program staff to handle what oftentimes are very external factors. So the first thing that we want to start with is reflecting a little bit on what are maybe a couple of the key areas of transformation that needs to happen to support workforce well-being. And then we want to move and unpack these concepts even more. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to have all three of the home visiting panelists reflect on this idea of some of those key areas of transformation. I also have seen a few things coming in the chat, so do keep up with sharing your thoughts on what may be these key ideas of transformation. But let's start with Devin with some feedback, some reflection.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I feel I agree with a lot of what was said. And I feel that there are a lot of materials out there that suggest that the individual home visitor is responsible for their own well-being. And while that may be partially true, it is definitely a team effort. And so when I think about, some things that can help with promoting home visitor well-being, I think about just like work environments and like agency culture of like supporting, self-care, not just individually, but like as a team. So maybe that's team building activities, reflective supervision, and really just giving that time during our busy work days with home visiting, to support each other.
Thanks, Devin. How about Tyler next?
Yeah, I want to echo everything that Devin said as well. You're going to hear that a lot from me. I think Devin and April had great ideas, and I was actually jealous of some of the things that they were talking about. I was like, they had a better idea than I did. But I think one of the biggest things is like supportive leadership, but also the idea of like encouragement to try new things. And sometimes that means making those mistakes. And so kind of that encouragement and the backing with that to try it, and maybe it didn't go so well, but to be able to do that, and to be able to do that in our program with our teams, but kind of also looking at it of like, oh, hey, maybe we're going to try this thing as a whole and see where it goes. And so I think, like virtual home visiting is a huge part of that. If we tried it in this like huge pandemic and it was like, oh, this is great, this works well, maybe there are other ideas like that as a whole that we could bring in as well.
One of the questions that was just posed in the chat is sort of the question that we're grappling with today, is this idea of that there are things that programs do at the programmatic level to support well-being, but there's also a lot of external forces on home visiting programs. One of the most sort of major external force is funding. And funding often dictates or drives a lot of what we are dealing with and how we respond. And so pushing ourselves in this reflection and thinking as a group to how some of these things move from the programmatic level to systems, right? Like, how do we think about the system or the structural change that has to happen? And Lori Rogman put a question in the chat about the idea of how do we secure the funding? Because sometimes the reason that things aren't able to happen as robustly as we'd like them to is because there's not resources to support the carving out of staff time for the other activities, the leadership pipeline development, all of those sorts of things. It's just too much because the amount of things that it takes to do the job. And so I want to move us to make sure that we get to able to reflect on all of the questions that we have in front of us this morning to the kind of this first area of pretty significant external factor on home visiting as a field, is related to funding. It has a significant external force in the form of regulations, meeting contract standards, program standards, right? There's a lot of pieces to it. And so the first reflective question that I want us to hear from the panelists about is this idea of how adhering to funder or system requirements affects your role as home visiting staff. And I promise I am going to share the slides again so that you all don't have to just remember the question that I said there. So this is the question that we're going to start by hearing from April on this idea of how is adhering to these things, these requirements, affecting your role as a home visiting staff.
So being a Tribal McVie home visiting grantee, we are given a shell of kind of the expectation of what comes under funding. And with that, there is a lot of outside requirements from evaluation to benchmarks that we have to hit on for the funders. And also it's a reflection of just ensuring that the work that we're doing is having an impact on families. And so I think that, with Tribal McVie, they've provided a lot of supports for each individual home visiting program. And one great thing is, being able to tailor home visiting to the Native communities that we are living in. And so we're able to really target and be very specific about what some of the goals and objectives are, really tying in, the culture and the language with the home visiting. So you really have a balance of, the evidence-based practice and what each Indigenous community really feels that they need some support around. And so for me, I think that's been something that, has been really helpful, but also at the same time, the burden that can sometimes come up on programs, especially a smaller workforce. So if you have a program that maybe has 5 employees as opposed to another program that maybe has 25 employees, where more of that work can be spread out among the staff, then the burden is kind of spread out. So it's more equally, the responsibility is carried by the larger programs, whereas that burden can tend to be somewhat overbearing for smaller programs. And so really, trying to navigate that, how you balance what the funders want and also being able to deliver service.
See between some of what we're reflecting on and what we're already seeing in the chat, we're starting to see an upstream issue here. And by that, we mean that what level the work or the remediation of a challenge occurs at, right? There's a lot of things that programs do at that programmatic level, but as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of things that are not necessarily appropriate to that program level, or you can't do it alone, right? We can't just as a program, no matter how much we want to try and solve. And that's what we sort of refer to as we need to move upstream, that there's things that are coming down to us as programs that if that looked different at upstream, it would make an impact on our program experience. And we see some definite reflection of that in the chat. I wanted to have Devin share some more of her reflections on this idea of adhering to system requirements.
Yeah, I think April hit a lot of really good points. Adhering to funder system requirements, it has a lot of impacts on the home visitor role. And I think that there is that pressure to meet your benchmarks, your data points, your due dates, and that can take away from being present during a home visit with the family, especially if there are other things going on. I think that, some of the system requirements can help guide visits in a lot of way and kind of make sure that we're following our programs and fulfilling them to give families the best services. But I do agree that sometimes trying to meet those benchmarks can be a little bit challenging, especially if a family is going through a tough time and you're trying to get them to think of goals and they don't even know what they're putting on the table for dinner tonight, but those data points are also so important because that's how we get our funding to do what we do. So that's kind of my thoughts on the different ways that it impacts a home visitor's role.
Yeah, what's the driver, right? And making sure that the driver is not the benchmarks or the program requirements, but the family is retained as the driver, but that balance can be difficult. Some of the other things that we think about, with upstream, and some of it is in the chat as well, is this idea of efficiency. The home visiting panel, in reflecting and getting ready for this morning, talked about the idea of what is why are we collecting it? And if some of the impact or how the data could be used to demonstrate the impact of the program, that may help to also sort of not retain why it's important to do the data collection, because we know that inherently, but also we get more benefit out of it if it then was able to be fed back into demonstrating the impact of the program, the benefit to the program, to families and communities, right? Some of those other pieces. But I think there is definitely an upstream here around keeping the sort of appropriate measure of paperwork and data collection and the systems that data collection goes into, keep that in an appropriate measure with the families as the focus of the primary work of the home visiting program, right? When we think about, and so how do we raise some of those issues up to that more upstream is one of our goals as a field, to make sure it's not just at the program level that you're all in an echo chamber telling each other these things, but that it's coming up to that next level. The next area that I want to move to continues on with fiscal. It gets into even more specific workforce well-being as we think about the financial considerations for the home visitor workforce well-being. What are some of the key financial considerations that we need to address? And I'd like to start with Tyler reflecting on this question first, to share some of her thoughts on this idea of financial considerations.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest key financial decisions or considerations for myself is just a livable wage. And, knowing that, hey, like this is going to be able to pay my bills, but also be able to let me enjoy some fun things. I can maybe go on a vacation. But the idea that I could possibly save or enjoy kind of life outside of work is a big thing for financial considerations. And I know every program has different abilities and different funding. And so, but being able to have it across the board that this is what we do so that we are able to continue to do other things in our own lives.
All right, so livable wage, living wage. We know with home visiting that 70 to 80% of most home visiting program budgets are compensation, personnel, really, whether it's the home visiting direct service staff, the program management supervisors, that you are the bulk of the budget. And if we also know that there's a disconnect often between how much we are reimbursed for the service and how much it actually costs us to do the work, the only place in the budget is going to be in that personnel line. And so we know from years and years of programs talking about that, as the quote says on the screen, the salaries aren't great. And it's in part because there's nowhere to go. They're without more revenue, raising salaries and addressing compensation is a considerable issue. So I think that idea of living wage is a critical consideration there. What additional key financial considerations? How about Devin? What other things are on your mind?
Oh, I mean, what Tyler said, I think first and foremost, livable wage. But I also think about just having the opportunity for raises, bonuses, incentives, benefits. Does your agency offer any medical leave, maternity leave? And kind of hitting back on a main point that was mentioned earlier, the flexibility with hours. I'm super grateful for the agency that I work for now. We work what's called like a flex time schedule. So if I need to, come in late one day because I have a doctor's appointment, that is no big deal and I can work late a different day. And so I think that that's something that's really important to me when it comes to the financial considerations. I don't have to worry about, missing work because I'm taking care of myself. That time can be made up another day.
There's sort of an unspoken value to the flexibility to be able to take care of that work-life balance, it sounds like.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
April, are there other pieces that you want to share from your vantage point on those key financial considerations?
Yeah, definitely echo what the girls have said, but I also think that creating accessible childcare for the home visitors. So this is it again, it's the systems and the lack of the workforce that we're seeing right now sometimes can inhibit the availability of home visitors to do the work because they themselves are seeking out adequate childcare to be able to show up to work. So, that's definitely something that supporting the workforce through having childcare for the workers themselves. And also just the flexibility of service delivery. I think COVID taught us all that, trying to do virtual visits and phone visits really was helpful at a time when, before COVID, we only knew of in-person home visits. And so I think being open and being able to be flexible of how services are delivered is very helpful. And really just trying to think outside the box. There's so much evidence that home visiting is meaningful work. We're making an impact, and yet we're finding that we have to constantly kind of prove the value of the work that we're doing. So I think just really, being able to deliver the services of home visiting in ways that are more creative and that are going to still be beneficial and meaningful to the families.
As we think about some of these things as upstream issues, one of the major things that also comes up is equity across, especially when we think about financial considerations for programs, right? We know that sometimes we hear in communities or within states that there will be instances where they may be able to give better compensation or better benefits to one program because of the funding of that program, but not for another model. Oftentimes things do come down to certain funding streams fund certain models. This happens across just the way that our system has been built, trying to think about those things in an equitable fashion so that we're addressing living wage and discretionary benefits like health insurance and access to childcare across models, across funding streams, across programs that deliver home visiting, right? So that we don't build a further siloed. This is definitely another example of it upstream, right? That we need to be thinking about. It's not to be solved at the program level as well alone. But this definitely also ties to our next reflection question. And I really hope that the chat jumps in with us here on this one too, around the idea of workforce equity and what is needed, how do we go about promoting workforce equity? I think the financial considerations is one piece of it, but I don't believe that is the only piece. And so I want to push us to think a little bit about this idea of workforce equity as well. Let's start with Tyler to reflect a little on workforce equity.
I was not prepared to go first on this one. Sorry, Gina. Workforce equity. So I think the biggest one for me is having early childhood, which includes the home visiting force, right? But having early childhood as a whole, not seen as just babysitting, and that the work that we do is valuable and not just for those who need it, but that everyone can benefit from it. And so I think just kind of highlighting that work and being able to have everyone kind of understand that would really promote the entire workforce as a whole.
I appreciate you jumping in there, Tyler, and sorry to put you on the spot. That value of the work and that understanding that value, and the value is shared across funding streams, across models, across programs, right? I think that is a step in the direction of workforce equity. How about Devin?
Yeah, I completely echo what Tyler said. I think there needs to be more awareness about what we do and the impact that it has, and kind of breaking that stigma, like Tyler mentioned, that it's not just for those in need. Everyone can benefit from it. And then I think just, in the workforce, just like equal opportunities across, all the different types of programs. So whether that's like trainings or conferences, resources, and just kind of like in a specific workplace, like that all staff are treated equally and fairly. So the same rules and expectations for all are an equal recognition and compensation.
More education to society is one of the things that came in the chat, and that to value this sort of prevention and value it in all the ways that it's delivered, so that we are seeing things as having impact in it. Not one is better than another, but there's lots of ways to impact communities and families, and those should be responsive to the communities and families. I do want to move us to our last question before we move to a little bit of Q&A. It's a pretty big one. It builds on many of these ideas, and certainly builds on this idea of workforce equity, but it pushes us to think a little bit about the idea of the strategies or tools that would support building community for home visitors and supervisors. So this is sort of like, culmination of things coming together. And so I'd like to have Devin start. I know that Devin, you just wrapped for us, but if you don't mind picking up with this one, and here's some of your reflections on this idea of what are some of those upstream strategies or tools to promote building community.
No problem, Gina. I think this specific question I could probably talk for hours about, so I will try to keep it short for you all. But I think to just kind of put it in a box, just the word support screams at me. I think just the building of community, like I know in my office, we do like peer support meetings where all the home visitors will get together once a month for an hour and kind of talk about challenges, successes, support each other. You got that reflective supervision. Our funding source does, quarterly support forums where home visitors from across the whole state can connect. Once every couple of months, we do like team building activities, which everyone's schedule is so busy, and we're trying to meet, all these data points, but setting aside an hour once a month or every other month to just connect. I feel like those are some good strategies to kind of build that community, not only in your office, but just like with each other as humans, because that's what we all are at the end of the day. And then I think just, as far as community, like in our communities, just that outreach piece, connecting with community partners and kind of spreading that same love and awareness.
Okay. I think the community building within programs, right, often feels like it's something that's very much the program's responsibility to build that community across home visitors and supervisors. So continuing to kind of push us of how could some of those ideas that Devin shared become more systemic. One of the pieces which maybe is a bit more fiscal consideration, but certainly could support this idea of a community where we believe in supporting each other's mental health. In the chat, there was a mention it'd be nice if we had some paid mental health days in our paid time off. And some of you may be saying, I'd like to have paid time off, period. So whether they're called for mental health days or whatever, but either way, right, like thinking about the idea of making some of those things more systemic values also reinforces how at the program level, you're able to build a community where that sort of support for each other's well-being is inherent, because it's also part of the structure of staffing and how the budget's built. And that's that puts a different perspective on it than just we do things as a group to value each other, but sort of adding it to like the systemic or structural way that our programs operate, and having that come even again further upstream from funding sources and the values that we hold as a field, I think is another key piece of that. Tyler, how about some reflections on this idea of community building?
Yeah, so I love everything that Devin had shared. We also, in just kind of our office that I work in, we'll do like potlucks every once in a while, where we just take lunch to be able to be like, okay, let's chat, let's eat, let's just kind of focus on each other and share life with each other. And that's been really beneficial for us. But I think another way that we try to build community is kind of across the different programs. And so going to conferences, oh, I almost forgot that word there, but like going to different conferences or attending different things like this, where we have the opportunity to kind of connect with other home visitors across programs, but also kind of across just like the program model and across funding sources, to be able to connect and just kind of share some of the strengths that we're working with there, and be able to, ask for some suggestions or for some support in other ways.
So you take that idea of community and make it more literally about the community, the programs that are in your regional community, broadening it out, and start to then sort of support it to become part of the field. This idea of being a community that supports each other as home visiting programs, not just individual home visitors, individual models, individual funding streams, right? But come together more, for sure. I want to take a little bit of a pivot with this idea of community and impact of community. I think one of the things that we are somewhat inherently referring to is the idea of the impact of the program on families and the benefit of the program on families. Well, in the beginning, when we thought about the idea, this concept of what supports you to be successful in your role, many of you mentioned that the success of the families that you work with, the relationship you have with them, the trust. And so there's an inherent nature of the impact, the positive impact of home visiting on families that is woven throughout this idea of professional well-being. I'd like to ask April to reflect a little bit on this idea of the impact of the existence of the programs on communities, and sort of what that means to us as a community, a home visiting community.
Yeah, with Tribal McVie, we've been very mindful of having that awareness and really knowing our communities and what those needs are, and being able to build programming around that. I think, as we all know, as home visitors, our work with families and the relationships with the children, that partnership is really helping to build that foundation for the child for the rest of their life. And so we may not see the immediate results of that tomorrow or next month. The results of this work are going to be seen years down the road. And so I think, really being able to build programming that is tailored specifically to what the family's needs are, aside from what the funders need, and just really, making every home visit with a family is a very personal experience. Home visiting is hard work, and it's also heart work. So I think that, that's something that we definitely, what makes us so unique as home visitors is that, we're trying to plant those seeds to create, stronger children. And it begins really in these early 5 years of life.
Thank you, April. I'm not sure if everyone's as familiar with this in Zoom, but as screen sharing, I'm getting all the hearts coming up from the corner of my screen, echoing the thumbs up, the clapping. So it's a really fun thing to sort of watch, to see how we are communicating with each other, not just in things we're typing in the chat, but how we feel about what we're hearing each other say. So thank you all for keeping up the little hearts coming up along the side. We're very close to the end of our time together, the very beginning of the summit, which is very exciting to continue to be able to be part of discussions that go down deeper paths of some of the concepts we've introduced here. But before we wrap with the plenary, as I mentioned at the outset, we did allow for some time for a Q&A, and there have been a few different questions that have come in the chat. And I want to maybe pivot us a little bit to how we go about this Q&A, that maybe instead of it being, because the questions are actually not just straight questions for us as a panel or for Mariel presenting on the well-being research, but the questions are more about how do we take action together. And so I'd like to put this back upon the group a little bit on this idea of how do we take action together. There's some specific things. There's the idea of the data burden and how do we better message that? How do we better quantify that so that the folks that are in more of the decision-making roles upstream have more information they can use to guide and be informed to make choices that would make a more efficient approach to some of our data capturing. So there's some resources to build there that give us some consistent messaging around something like the data collection and where that presents at times a pretty great burden on programs. That's a very concrete sort of, let's create a tool, or let's create some messaging resources that can be used by the field. Then it even broadens out a little bit to think about this idea of how this whole message of the workforce crisis, that how do we ensure that we are speaking the language of the audiences that need to hear us, to really message what the elements of the workforce crisis and the need for workforce well-being are, what that is in quantity as best as we can, to put some sort of numbers to it and the impact of it, and that we can tie it to the change that we believe needs to be made. And so what I'm thinking about as a group is, I want to hear from you a little bit in the chat on what could help you with this. It seems to me what I would want is some messaging, some consistent answers to different questions. They might not be specific only to the state of Illinois. They may be more sort of in an aggregate for the home visiting field, but that I could then put into practice, that I could use in advocating locally. I could use when I have the opportunity to talk to legislators in my state. Right? I think there's some things that if we all had access to them, that we could put them into practice in thousands of ways across a group of nearly 800 participants this morning. And I think we'd like to commit to that as a field together. Later in the summit, we have a session on the fiscal impact of the workforce crisis, how much turnover costs, how underfunded programs are. Part of what we're doing at that session is putting numbers as a messaging tool so that the power of you as a field can go out and use that. It sounds to me like there's interest in that same sort of like activation around this issue. And I'm curious to hear in the chat if that's true, if I'm hearing the right thing. So I'm going to pause for a second and sort of hear from folks for a minute, see if the chat's got some responses. So I'm going to pause on screen sharing so we can see each other instead. And from our home visiting panel, how does that resonate with you as you've been watching the chat? These sorts of building of some consistent resource and very simple sort of resourcing tools that could be used for messaging in this. Does this seem like a direction we should be going together as a field?
Yeah, I agree. The overburden of the paperwork and the reporting definitely does take a lot away. And I think it would be nice for us to be able to highlight more of the work and the perspectives. I know somebody shared something about getting family success stories, really helping, the funders and people that are not necessarily doing the work to understand that, this is a need, and that to do the work of home visiting really requires that relationship. And sometimes that can be interrupted by having to do all of these other tasks. And so, yeah, I think, there definitely needs to be a change in maybe how some of the reporting is done. That would be very helpful.
Push them to see home visiting more than if you're not in it, it's hard to understand.
Less data and more of the actual work itself.
Yeah, Gina, do you mind if I jump in as well?
Yeah, go ahead, Tina.
Awesome. I think for me, I would love to see just like some language that I could use when I am speaking to kind of like local senators or House of Representatives type of people, to be able to speak to them in a way that they understand. And it's not just the heartwarming stories, because I think that those are great and those get us far. But how do I also share like, hey, this is important because of this, not just because of the heartwarming stories, but what we're doing and how this impacts everyone, and not just like the Senate and the House of Representatives for local states, your local people, but also kind of our countrywide, and then kind of just other people who have money and who have funding, and how do you talk to them and kind of make those connections on a different level than just, here's my heartwarming story, please donate one time, but the continuous impact.
To speak their language. Well, thank you all for indulging me in that idea of a little bit of co-creation as a field to how we activate to respond to this. I want to thank all of our panelists for their time to prepare for and be the sort of face of the field, the voices of the field. So thank you, Devin, Tyler, April, and Dr. Spar. We really appreciate all of your time. And I'm going to turn it back to Kelly Woodlock for a couple of closing comments.